my name is FALAHI binti SHAHRIL and my matric number is 2019-405318. Arrangement of regulation. First, preliminary. Second, permissible exposure limit. Third, exposure monitoring. 4, method of compliance. 5, hearing protection device. 6, audiometric testing program. 7, employee information and training. 8, warning sign. 9, record keeping. And 10, miscellaneous. To all factory in which persons are employed in any occupation involving exposure to excessive noise level in the workplace. Section 4, obligation of occupier and employee. First, it is the duty of every occupier pursuant to Regulation 3 to comply with this regulation. Second, in pursuant of this regulation, every employee shall A. Cooperate with this occupier by wearing a noise dosimeter during employee exposure monitoring. B. Wear and make full and proper use of the hearing protection device provided for his use. C. Attend for and undergo audiometric testing or any medical examination or test arranged by the occupier. D. Attend employee information and training programs conducted by the occupier. Part 2 is about permissible exposure limit. Section 5. Permissible exposure limit. First, no employee shall be exposed to noise level exceeding equivalent continuous sounds level of 90 decibels or exceeding the limit specified in the first schedule or exceeding the daily noise dose of unity. Second, no employee shall be exposed to noise level exceeding 150 decibel at any times. Section 9, initial employee exposure monitoring. First, an occupier shall conduct initial exposure monitoring in pursuance to Regulation 8 months within 6 months from the date this regulation takes effect. Second, an initial employee exposure monitoring may be limited to one or more representative employee or employees from a particular group of employees performing the same work or from the same workplace, who the occupier reasonably believe is or are exposed to noise level representative of the group of employees. Section 10, positive initial employee exposure monitoring. First, where an initial employee exposure monitoring shows the possibility of any employee exposure to noise level at or above the action level, the occupier shall determine noise exposure level for employees engaged in the same work or from the same workplace within 6 months. Second, an employee exposure monitoring may be limited to one or more representative employee or employees from a particular group of employees performing the same work or from the same workplace, who this occupier reasonably believe is or are exposed to noise level representative of the group of employees. Section 11, negative initial employee exposure monitoring. Where an initial employee exposure monitoring shows that no employee is exposed to noise level at or above the action level, the occupier needs to determine noise exposure level for each and every employee engaged in the same work or from the same workplace, except as otherwise provided in Regulation 12. 12. Additional monitoring. Whenever there has been a production, process, equipment, countermeasure, or personnel change in the factory, the occupier shall conduct additional monitoring within 6 months from the dates of such change or changes. Section 13, employee notification. Within 2 weeks after the receipt of the employee exposure monitoring results, the occupier shall notify each employee of the result of the monitoring. Part 5, method of compliance. Section 15, engineering and administrative control. The occupier shall reduce and maintain employee exposure to noise level below the limit prescribed in Regulation 5 by A. Engineering control as far as is reasonably practicable, B. Administrative control, or C. Both of the above. Part 6. Hearing Protection Device. Section 17. General. First, an occupier shall, at no cost to the employee, provides an approved hearing protection device to and ensure it is used by A. An employee exposed to noise level at or above the limit prescribed in Regulation 5 and 6. B. An employee receiving a daily noise dose between 0.5 and 1 if his baseline audiogram show a hearing impairment, or if his annual audiogram show a standard threshold shift, or C. An employee who is required to wear a hearing protection device in accordance with this provision of this regulation. Second, the hearing protection device provided in pursuant to sub-regulation first shall A. correctly fit the employee, B. be compatible with the job requirement of the employee, and C. not prejudice the health of the employer. Section 18. Hearing Protection Device Attenuations. First, a hearing protection device provided in pursuant to Regulation 17 shall attenuate employee exposure to noise level below the limits prescribed in Regulation 5 and 6. Second, hearing protection device provided in pursuant to Regulation 17 shall attenuate employee exposure to noise level below the actions level.
Proceeds to the part 6, which is audiometric testing program. An audiometric test should be tested by a few conditions, which is to be conducted by a technician under the supervision of a registered medical practitioner. Other than that, it is preceded by a period of a quiet of at least 14 hours. It also shall be carried out in a room background noise level meeting a requirement specified in the second schedule, while in pure tone air conduction with test frequencies including 500, 1000 and up to 6000 Hz taken separately for each ear. Next, Section 31, which is baseline audiogram and occupational and medical history record. It is a comparison of a valid baseline audiogram against subsequent audiogram. It should record of the medical and occupational history of every employee within 12 months or 6 months from the day employee commenced the work. Move to Section 22, which is frequency of audiometric testing. Audiometric tests on employees should be repeated, which is after obtaining the baseline audiogram. It is done each year for employees exposed to noise level over the accepted range. It is also for employees whose baseline audiogram reveals a hearing impairment or whose annual audiogram shows a standard threshold shift. Once in every 2 years for an employee exposed to noise level greater than the action level but less than the limits. Next, Section 23, which is retest. It is to retest the employee within 3 months of the date of the last audiometric test. Next is Part 7, which is employee information and training. On Section 27, which is the training, it is to provide a training program, and during the training program, each of the employee is informed of few things such as the provision of this regulation, the effect of noise on hearing, the function of hearing protection device, the benefits, limitations, how to select, fit, use, and care for it. Apart from that, they also will be informed about the purpose of an audiometric testing and an explanation of the test procedures. Next is Part 8, the record keeping. In this part, there is Section 29, which is the exposure monitoring records. This is for establish and maintain an accurate records of all exposure monitoring, which include a few things such as the name of the employee, the daily noise dose, the location, date and time of measurement, and the noise level obtained. This exposure monitoring records is maintained for as long as the employee's employment. Moving to the next section, which is Section 30. It is audiometric test record. So here, we must keep an accurate record of all employee audiographs, which include the name and job location of the employee, and also the date of the audiograph. We also should keep other information such as the name of the person conducting the test, the model, the date of the last calibration of the audiometric testing equipment, and this audiometric test record should be retained for 5 years. Part 10. The miscellaneous. In Section 36, there is about the penalty, which upon the conviction, fines is not exceeding 1,000 ringgit. Moving to the next regulation, which is the Factories and Machinery Mineral Dust Regulations 1989. There are a few arrangements of the regulation, which is Part 1, the preliminary, Part 2, permissible exposure limits, Part 3, exposure monitoring, Part 4, methods of compliance, Part 5, PPE, Part 6, housekeeping, Part 7, medical examination, Part 8, changing rooms and locker, Part 9, employee information and training, Part 10, record keeping, Part 11, warning signs, and Part 12, miscellaneous. And here we need to know about the HL level, which is half the value of the PEL. And the crystalline silica is a crystalline form of free silica which include the quartz, crystalline, and tridymite. Mineral dust is the dust of the mineral. And the permissible exposure limits are defined as the maximum allowable concentration of mineral dust which may expose to an employee, while the respirable dust mean the fraction of airborne dust collected on a filtering media during personal sampling which penetrate through a size selector with the following characteristics. Introducing Part 1, which is the preliminary. In this part, there is Section 3, which is the application. This application should be applied to all factories where there are processes of using the mineral dust. Next is Section 5, which is the sandblasting. Sandblasting is the act of propelling a very fine particle of an abrasive material at a very high velocity toward a surface in order to clean it. Because of the high risk of the silicosis in the sandblaster and the difficulty in controlling the exposure, sandblasting process should not be used in any factory unless with the approval from the chief inspector. Next, Part 2, which is the permissible exposure limits. We should stipulate the exposure limits in normal breathing condition and wearing respiratory protection. This permissible exposure limits is in Section 6. Firstly, which is the mineral dust. It must containing less 1% of free silica. Next, the worker exposure should not exceed the average concentration for a duration of 8 hours. Other than that, the respirable dust should be 5 mg per meter cube air. Total dust, which is 10 mg per meter cube air. Next is crystalline silica. A worker exposure should not exceed the average concentration for a duration of 8 hours. And the respirable cristobalite should be 0.05 mg per meter cube air. Other than that, the respirable quartz is only 0.1 mg per meter cube air, and the respirable tridymite, which is 0.05 mg per meter cube air. Next, Section 7, the permissible exposure limits when using the respirators. There are a few conditions which, if more than the permissible exposure limits, we should provide the clothing that covers the whole body, glove, hats, shoes, face shield, goggle, and the other relevant PPE. The employee is responsible to provide facilities for the hygiene and disposal of the clothing and the equipment.
Assalamualaikum and hi, my name is FAKHIRA HANIM BINTI Muhammad Zohri from RAS 2015A. Today I will continue to present about Factories and Machinery Mineral Dust Regulation 1989. For the purpose of this part, employee exposure is the exposure that will occur if the employee is not using a respirator. In Section 9, an occupier shall conduct an initial employee exposure monitoring for all employees working in a mineral processing area within 6 months from the date this regulation takes effect or within 3 months from the day the employee commences work to determine the percentage of free silica by weight in the mineral dust that the employee is exposed to. Besides, Section 10 frequency monitoring stated if the employee exposure monitoring conduct employee exposure to be below the action level, the monitoring need not be repeated except as otherwise provided by Regulation 11. Next, if the employee exposure monitoring is conduct, employee exposure is at or above the action level but below the limit specified, The occupier shall repeat monitoring in accordance with this part at least once every 6 months. The occupier shall continue monitoring at the required frequency until at least 2 consecutive measurements taken at least 7 days apart or below the action level, at which time the occupier may discontinue monitoring for the employee except as otherwise provided by Regulation 11. However, if the employee exposure monitoring conduct under Regulation 8 reveals that employee exposure is above the limit specified in Regulation 9, the occupier shall repeat monitoring once every 3 months. The occupier shall continue monitoring at the required frequency until at least 2 consecutive measurements taken at least 7 days apart are below the limit specified in Regulation 6 but at or above the action level, at which time the occupier may repeat monitoring for the employee at the frequency specified in sub-regulation previously. Next, Section 11, Additional Monitoring. Whenever there has been a production, process, control equipment, or personnel change that may result in new or additional exposure to mineral dust, or wherever an occupier has any other reason to suspect a change that may result in new or additional exposure to a mineral dust. Additional monitoring in accordance with this part shall be conducted within 30 days from the date of change. Next, Section 12, Employee Notification. Within 2 weeks after the receipt of employee exposure monitoring result, the occupier shall notify each employee of the result of the monitoring. Second, whenever the result indicate that the representative employee exposure without regard to the use of respirator exceed the limit specified, the occupier shall notify the employee that the limit specified in Regulation 6 were exceeded. Next, Section 13, Method of Monitoring and Analysis. The occupier shall use an approved method of monitoring and analysis. Employee exposure monitoring shall be conducted by a competent person. The term of competent person is used in many OSHA standards and documents. An OSHA competent person is defined as one who is capable of identifying existing and predictable hazards in the surrounding of or working conditions which are unsanitary, hazardous, or dangerous to employees, and who has the authorization to take prompt corrective measures to eliminate them. In Part 4, Section 14 to 17, stated specify the requirement of using control equipment for operation, inspection, and examination of the control equipment. Next, water spray is distributed as possible and shall cover the entire surface of the mineral processing area. For respiratory protection, the occupier should provide approved respiratory protective equipment. In Part 5, Personal Protective Equipment, Section 20 stated protective equipment to be cleaned and stored in a locker, protective equipment not to be used by another person. Firstly, all protective clothing, respiratory protective equipment, and other protective equipment shall be kept clean and be stored in a locker provided for such storage and shall not be removed from such locker except for use, cleaning, or other necessary purpose. Second, no protective clothing or respiratory protective equipment or any other protective equipment which has been used by a person shall be provided for use by any other person unless it has been thoroughly cleaned since last being used. This section is important to avoid people inhaling airborne dust at work due to the risk of occupational disease. Year after year, both in developed and in developing countries, overexposure to dust causes disease, temporary and permanent disabilities, and death. In Part 6, which is housekeeping, there are stated about the surface in Section 20. This section stated that all surface in mineral processing area shall be maintained as far as is practicable in a clean state and be free from accumulation of mineral dust. On the other hand, dust in the workplace not also affect the workers but may also contaminate or reduce the quality of product, be the cause of fire and explosion, and damage the environment. Other than that, the regulation in this part with the Section 23, an occupier shall, at his cost, provide or make available medical examination to an employee who in the course of his normal employment in the factory is exposed to crystallized silica at or above the action level. Other than that, an occupier shall arrange for each such employee to undergo a prescribed medical examination within 6 months from the date this regulation take effect or within 3 months from the date the employee commences work, unless he has undergone a prescribed medical examination within the 2 years preceding such date and thereafter at intervals not longer than 2 years, except in the case of an employee who is suffering from an early stage of pneumoconiosis who shall undergo a prescribed medical examination at intervals not exceeding 1 year. Next, Section 24, Prescribed Medical Examination. The prescribed medical examination refers to a medical examination conducted by a registered medical practitioner that comprise of or include a chest X-ray, which is posterior anterior 350 mm by 430 mm, a statement of a medical, occupational, and smoking history of the person examined, a clinical examination of the chest and pulmonary function test, including testing of forced vital capacity and forced respiratory volume at 1 second, detailed examination for tuberculosis, and any laboratory or other test which the examining registered medical practitioner deems necessary by sound medical practice. Moreover, Part 9 is Employee Information and Training. Section 29 stated that the occupier shall institute a training program for and ensure the participation of all employees exposed to crystalline silica dust at or above the action level. The occupier shall ensure that during the training program, each employee is informed of the following, which are the provisions of this regulation, the specific nature of the operation which can result in exposure to mineral dust, the purpose, proper selection, fitting, maintenance, use and limitation of respiratory protective equipment, the purpose and description of the prescribed medical examination, including information concerning the adverse health effects associated with exposure to mineral dust, and the control equipment and work procedure associated with the employee's job assignment. However, the training program shall be repeated at least once in 2 years. In this part of Section 30, Medical Report and Records stated the occupier shall keep in the factory and in good condition the report furnished to him by the registered medical practitioner as required under Regulation 25 for the period of employment of the employee and for at least 20 years thereafter. The registered medical practitioner shall establish and maintain an accurate record, including all X-ray photographs for each employee, subject to medical examination in pursuance to Regulation 24 for the period of employment of the employee and for at least 20 years thereafter. Lastly, Part 12 is miscellaneous. In Section 36, penalty stated that any person who contravenes any provision of this regulation shall be guilty of an offence and shall, on conviction, be liable to a fine not exceeding 1,000 ringgit. That's all from me. Thank you.